Good morning, everybody. This is Perspectives on Sustainable Development. I'm your host, Chris Whitehead, and I have a very exciting episode for you guys today. I have been kicking around this idea for a while, but today is the day we're going to launch it. Up until this point, almost every episode we've done has been two guests talking for roughly an hour, taking on a major topic. I'm switching that up a little bit starting today for about 6 or 7 episodes, roughly, to talk to authors one on one about their recent works, why they decided to write a book, what's driven them, how they went about putting the book actually together, and why they chose the topic that they chose. And to be really honest, I'm doing this also a little bit for selfish reasons because I have toyed with the idea of doing a book myself for a while now, and I have a couple ideas I am starting to work on a little bit. And we'll probably try to put more time on when I eventually find time. But with a 7 and 9 year old alone, that can be challenging. But then teaching and starting a company, the hours in the day I start to tend to go a little short. But I wanted to do my homework and talk to people who have gone through the process and learn, frankly, as much as I can. And every author I've chosen to be in this series has done really impressive, honestly, inspirational work to me, and all unrelated topics that I've covered in this podcast thus far, but all from a very, very interesting angle that I think would be very beneficial for all the various listeners of this program. The first author we're going to be speaking with, Leah Kral, wrote a book called Innovation for Social Change. And I've spoken about this ad nauseum, but my technical background is air quality work. But the last 7 or so years, maybe 8 now, I've gone into social impact work and risk minimization and working more directly with local communities and trying to affect positive change. And it's really become what I'm meant to be doing. So when I came upon Leah's work, I don't know, what is it now, 5, 6 months ago or so. Now I saw a lot of very obvious overlaps and was very interested by the work she's doing and especially how she's been able to help a number of nonprofits. And that's a focus of her book. So I suppose without any further ado, Leah, if you can come on camera, please. Good morning. How are you?
Hi, good morning. How are you, Chris?
Oh, not too bad. I'm excited to start this process.
Me too. Me too. It's an honor to be here today.
Excellent. I gave you a very brief intro, but can you give a little background on your history and then also why and how you decided to write the book?
Definitely. Yeah, I can share a bit of my story. So I think like a lot of people, my career has had some wild twists and turns and unexpected, paths. But the first 7 years of my work life, I was in the for-profit world, the business world, and I was working in engineering and quality systems. I'm from Northeast Ohio, and you're just kind of surrounded by that. And so I just thought, oh yeah, that's what I'll do. And so I did that for about 7 years, but and there were things I liked, but I also felt like something was missing and wasn't quite sure what. And so my husband and I were having all these conversations about what we wanted out of our lives and our careers, and we decided to really change things up and do something kind of wild and crazy. We signed up together as a married couple for a 2 year tour of duty in the Peace Corps. And so a few months later, we found ourselves living and working in Jamaica. And as you can imagine, those 2 years were really life-changing. All sorts of lessons that I came home with. But, while we do have poverty in the US, I had never seen extreme poverty like what we were seeing in Jamaica. Just to give you a picture, families living in shacks built by hand, with dirt floors and zinc roofs. Many of those were considered illegal squatters and lived under the threat of being bulldozed. I would regularly see children scavenging in garbage heaps to collect soda cans just so their family could buy food. People were just barely surviving. And it all sounds really harsh, and it was, but in the midst of all that poverty and need, I also saw heroes. And I always think of that Fred Rogers quote during September 11th, where he said something like, in times of crisis, look for the helpers. And they were absolutely there, and their generosity just moved me. So when I finished the 2-year tour of duty and came back to the US, of course, I could not get those people out of my mind. And what I figured out was if there was some way I could shape my career where I could take the good things that I learned from the business world, but find a way to support people solving social problems, the ones who are really giving people hope, that was kind of my dream. And then another thing that shaped my motivation, was that time prior to the Peace Corps, working in the for-profit world and quality systems. So there are all these people and thinkers I really admired, like people you probably read and like Drucker and Covey and Deming, really great business thinkers. And so I felt like having a foot in both worlds was a strength and a differentiator. And I realized what I might be able to do is help translate some of those really good management practices into the nonprofit world. But translate is a key idea, right? Because it can be we can cause pain by just taking things from one sector into another. But that's off to the side. So that's really what I've been doing for the last 20 years. And I feel like it's my own great honor to walk alongside what I'll call goodness entrepreneurs, mission-driven organizations and leaders and teams who are building a better world. And so as a consultant, author, and speaker, I get to support those leaders, in different ways, whether it's helping executive directors get what I'll call strategic clarity, maybe theory of change, or facilitating sessions with boards or teams to figure out how to be more effective and innovative. And so, I've been doing this work for a long time, really enjoying it. And it took someone else to propose the book to me. One day it was an executive director who said, "Hey, Leah, I've been hearing all these great things about these workshops of yours. Why don't you put it into book form?" And in a way, it was my secret kind of unspoken dream to do that because I had a lot of material, but I just thought I'm never going to have the time to do something like this. So it took someone else. But I realized he is so right. So at that point, then I just started taking all my materials and starting to put that into book form, which took a few years, but it was really a wonderful. Like I'm a thinker and writer and introvert, so it's actually very comfortable to write a book. The marketing part's another story, but so I was doing all that research. I brought in stories from nonprofits I worked with. And then pulled in stories from my research and interviews from places like Mayo Clinic, Habitat for Humanity, and a lot of others. And that writing process, all in all, took about 2.5 years, but I learned so much. And I'm so happy that it's getting a lot of interest. So that's the story.
Well, that's great. And honestly, just for a little bit of background, Leah and I did a prep call a couple weeks ago, and I knew there would be a lot of things we could talk about. But as soon as I heard the part about Peace Corps, I'm like, okay, my respect for her just went up a couple pegs. And then the overlap in Jamaica, because my wife and I honeymoon there. I'm like, okay, we're gonna have a whole bunch of stuff to talk about. Um, but I want to start on the idea of innovation in itself because I do a lot of work with community groups on environmental justice and climate change issues, and people have an idea or a thought that they think, okay, I want to try and help my community with this problem, but they don't ever know how to get started. Can you talk a little bit about how you would recommend taking that individual idea or that spark and actually building something from it?
Yeah. So I think that when maybe it's good to talk about kind of what do we mean by innovation? Because it can be so intimidating, and scare people away. Or like I think nonprofits are doing what you're talking about all the time. And I know you probably see that too, but we don't use the word innovation for ourselves. And why is that? So I might think of the business world. And, probably the first time I was seriously thinking about innovation, I did too, right? We think of, cool inventions like the iPad, or how when you visit the dentist office now, there's a 3D printer printing out your crown right there on the spot for your tooth, right? And that's all innovation. So I think our minds go off to that tech world or business world, and we don't think of our very important work. And so why don't we call ourselves innovators in this sector? I think sometimes the word innovation actually gets in the way of innovation, because it sounds so big. And somewhere along the way, we start associating it with Silicon Valley and the glamorous lone inventor myth, that so many people doing the most important work of finding breakthroughs don't really recognize themselves in it. And even our small, improvements that we find are still innovation. Um, so I think that language can trip us up. And so the definition I return to a lot is just that innovation is simply finding a newer, better way of doing something. It's as simple as that. That's it, and that's all innovation really is. And so when you use that definition, it feels a lot more approachable. And I think nonprofiteers maybe start to recognize themselves when they think of it that way. And suddenly the room is full of innovators, right? So my book is very full of stories of that. And when I finished writing it and counted up all the stories, I think I had 70 stories of nonprofit innovation, another 20 from foundations. And when you use that definition, you start looking, it's really not that hard to find. And so I think it's also helpful to kind of parse it out between what do we mean by like big innovation or just small everyday kind of process improvements. And so if you're thinking of a big innovation, I think of, for example, like the American Civil Rights Movement, using nonviolent practices was new in the US, right? And they made really big social breakthroughs. Or the creation of the 911 emergency system in the US is an innovation that came about from the partnerships between philanthropy, nonprofits, and first responders. That's big, right? Changed a lot. Or those big things that like the X Prize Foundation works on. And then you hear this term disruptive innovation. We hear that term thrown around a lot. And those are, a change that doesn't just make something a little better, but maybe changes the rules of the game and reshapes an entire field. So the classic business example might be ride sharing, right? Like Uber or Lyft. They didn't invent cars or taxis. What they used what already existed, but in a really new way, kind of reimagining the experience. And we have that too in our sector, in the nonprofit world. If you think about just one example, how Muhammad Yunus disrupted charitable giving by creating microfinance or direct cash transfers, that disrupted traditional charity because it was asking, well, what if we simply trust people with the resources directly? So that's a disruption, and we have those too. It might mean inventing something. There are examples of that. But I think what's most important and what's getting at your question, and I really want to emphasize this, is that innovation can be quite small and humble. And I think we forget that a lot. So I feel like that's my job to be out there kind of cheerleading for this. But, a program director who redesigned the intake process and cut wait times in half. Imagine a legal aid clinic. I've seen these, right, where you have a lot of walk-ins and clipboards and people writing a lot of stuff down on multiple pieces of paper. And what if the person at the reception desk just has the idea, well, why don't we change from the paper process to a tablet, right? Electronic tablet. Now the information is just going straight in. There's no double entry. And while that might seem really small, if you think about it, your process improvement just saved resources, time, and money that can now be put to better use elsewhere, right? So that matters a lot. Um, and so I think we're doing those sorts of things all the time, but we take our creativity and resourcefulness for granted in the nonprofit sector. And the last thing I'll say on this, and I'll stop talking so I don't go on and on too much, but if you think about it another way, I think that every nonprofit by default is actually a hypothesis. And you don't hear that a lot, but our mission statement really is a question. We could all reframe our mission statements as questions or as a hypothesis. And what we're really saying in our mission is we think we know how to achieve it, we think, but we don't know for sure. And so a lot of nonprofits are building a theory of change and testing it through trial and error. And so I share a lot of those in my book. Maybe think of Alcoholics Anonymous. They didn't start with it all figured out. They didn't start with a perfect model. If you know their story, the two founders were, people from different sides of the country who were really suffering with addiction, two professional men. And they ended up kind of randomly crossing paths, and just talking honestly with each other about their struggles. And they realized they stumbled onto the power of two alcoholics talking to one another. And it helped them personally, and they became really passionate about it, wanted to spread it, thought they might start a nonprofit, but they really weren't quite sure, right? So through years, right, of trial and error and figuring things out, they eventually came to their 12-step model. So you see how in that story they kind of started with a hypothesis that they tested, and we all do. And so I think innovation, really, to your question, it begins with curiosity and the willingness to ask, could there be a better way? Someone starts with questions and asks, what if or why not? And that's something any of us can do, right? It's a small thing to start with a question. Doesn't require a big budget. And if you do research into the origin stories of a lot of those nonprofits that are famous today and really big, they all started that way, with no resources, maybe just the seed of an idea. And so that's kind of the question behind my book is just that how do we encourage innovation and build it into our everyday workplace practices?
Yeah, it's really interesting. And I tell this story about how I started this podcast often to try to spark the same idea in others that I kept on hearing from folks again and again doing stakeholder engagement work that they wanted to learn more about these topics, but they didn't have time to go back to school, couldn't afford it, didn't know who to trust. Can you do anything to help? So I launched this podcast from my basement essentially almost 3 years ago. And now it's been downloaded in over 100, almost 100 countries. And that's not intended as a brag. That's intended that if anyone has a good idea, you never know if it's going to take off or not. But if you're passionate about it and willing to put the time in and try new things, kind of like what Leah was just talking about, you'd be kind of surprised as to how far that good idea can stretch. So that's another reason why I was definitely looking forward to having this chat today. And one of the things you talked about kind of hit home with me a little bit and kind of also reminded me about the compliance work I do. There's a thing called ISO 14001 that's centered around the idea of continuous improvement. If you think about that for a minute, it's innovation. If something didn't work as you intended, what can you do to fix it? What type of standards can you hold yourself to on an ongoing basis to keep finding better ways to do something? Does that kind of overlap into the type of work you do?
Yeah, definitely. It's so refreshing to hear someone mention in our sector. A lot of people aren't familiar with the quality standards like ISO 9000. But when I had mentioned I started out in the business world and quality systems, that was one of the things I worked on. So I'm very familiar with it. And I think that the idea of standards. It does apply and absolutely applies in our sector. And so in my book, I translated it to, I have a section on organizational design, which, I don't actually name ISO in the book, but the thoughts are in there. How do we design our organizations in a way that supports everyday innovation? You think of systems, things like what are our processes, and whether it's how do we intentionally create a culture that supports people bringing their ideas forward? What do our, HR systems like? Do we incentivize people or do we kind of create a culture of fear where people are wise to not speak up? Or, all those internal systems. And we have these risks of creating unintended bureaucracy like metrics, it's very hard to measure success. It takes a lot of careful thought and we can do it disastrously wrong. That's a type of organizational design. So I've got a lot of kind of chapters in the middle part of my book with stories and examples of how our systems can either help or hinder innovation, with a lot of stories to kind of illustrate the point. So I love that you brought that up.
Well, and actually, just if we want to focus it to again on the nonprofits themselves, um, do you often get brought into the nonprofits who might be, I don't like this term, but I'm going to go with it anyway, stuck in the mud or have ideas or things they want to do, but not really sure about how to actually affect them?
Yeah, yeah, I call it the when I think of what nonprofits struggle with, I'll call it the fog of good intentions. It's, we have so much passion for, and that's all I love working in the nonprofit sector because people kind of self-select. They're passionate about the social problem they want to solve. So passion is not the problem whatsoever, and it makes for, I think, a really nice work environment because people care, and your missions are so important for the people you're serving. So it's very fulfilling. But with what I call the fog of good intention, kind of like the Alcoholics Anonymous example, they kind of suspected they stumbled onto something and they cared so deeply because they suffered from it themselves, but they really weren't fully sure how they were going to move forward or create programs or help more people. And so we struggle with that. And related, there's that great quote by Stephen Covey that we might be climbing up the ladder, but is our ladder even leaning against the right wall in the first place? So it's a struggle. And now I think I've lost track of the original question you asked. I got so fired up and kind of lost in my thinking, but yeah, so I work with nonprofits to help them. I call it strategic clarity. It's cutting through that fog of good intentions to figure out what is it we're really trying to solve? Because it can be kind of muddled, like think of workforce development. Are you trying to help people who might readily go back into the workforce with just a little bit of training, or are you trying to help the chronically unemployed or underemployed? Totally different problem, different set of, programming interventions that you might do. But in a lot of cases, there's kind of that muddled sort of lack of clarity. So it takes a lot of intentional work to get to let's work hard to be as specific as we can about the problem we're trying to solve. I don't know if that did that answer your question?
It does, but then I think it also goes towards the fact that building those internal systems and the individual organization itself is so critically important because the um outside what's the word for it, impacts or sources or right, stuff impacting that nonprofit can often change. Just as an example, obviously funding at the federal level changed drastically over the last 18 months or so. So what I've seen, and I saw a lot of the same type of stuff. It's the established nonprofits who have the strong donor base, who have the strong structures in place, might have some type of ongoing measure for continuous improvement that have done better than the others. I don't know if you can speak to that at all.
I guess where my mind went when you were speaking, so I think we have to pivot all the time so the external landscape can change. I think, you're giving an example of the federal funding. Big change on the happening outside of your organization is going to affect you deeply. So I think of then we have to pivot, right? And pivot thoughtfully. So I think of an example would be during COVID, a lot of food banks that had kind of brick and mortar locations very wisely pivoted to like the food truck kind of format. And so their North Star didn't change, but external circumstances forced them, right, to rethink how they delivered the services. And so, yeah, and then you raise the question of like good infrastructure and ways of thinking about your success metrics. So I'm just thinking out loud, but yeah, hopefully those food bank organizations had thoughtful metrics in place and clear thinking about who are we serving, what does success look like, and ways of. So I think whether you're big or small, you can have really thoughtful metrics that help you answer the question, how do we know if what we're doing is working? That's what I think the purpose of metrics are, just to help you answer that. I don't know if that does that spark any thoughts or feel free to react to
Yeah,
that.
no, absolutely. And um, to be very honest, I'm still learning a lot of this because my background is largely industry and compliance work. And I don't want to say working at one end of the spectrum. And I hate the us versus them thing. So a lot of my time is spent on education efforts and trying to find areas for collaboration. And is that possibly a source for innovation itself too? How industry and nonprofits can find better ways of working together.
1,000% yes. Yeah, I think the challenge can be sometimes when funders and grantees talk past each other. I'm sure you've heard this a lot, where nonprofit teams feel really frustrated because they feel like metrics are just imposed on them from a funder, and those metrics end up not meaning anything to how they make decisions. So to me, the magic is when the nonprofits who are people on the front lines of the work, who are deeply immersed in it, propose their own metrics that make sense to them, that help them answer that question of how do we know if what we're doing is working. But then there's a negotiation process, right? The grant maker is taking risks, right? They could be putting that money elsewhere. So, do the metrics that the nonprofit is proposing really provide strong evidence? So there should be back and forth kind of negotiation, and that's healthy. And I think both learn if they're really listening and speaking to each other, and each have different vantage points. Like the grant maker, while they're not neck deep, carrying out the work, they may have relationships with many other people in the ecosystem and have pretty good knowledge from a higher level, right? So when those two parties come together, uh, you know, that's the ideal, right? Is that there's negotiation and learning happening between them both, if that makes sense.
No, it does, but I guess just to follow up or even possibly push back on that a little bit, is that something you've witnessed a lot of recently? I've been more hopeful. That's not the right word for it, but this topic has come further in the last couple of years than I personally witnessed in probably the previous 10 or so.
Yeah, yeah, I'd like to see more of that. And yeah, you're hearing a lot of like trust-based philanthropy and kind of an outcry for it. But we probably aren't seeing nearly enough of it. I mean, I have seen it at times, and I think it works brilliantly. But I think we need to see a lot more of that sort of thing. Yeah, and I think yeah, there's a power differential there too, like it's so hard for us to, for nonprofits to get funding. And so I think sometimes with the power differential there, maybe a lot of nonprofits are maybe afraid to speak up.
Hmm.
So a lot of the weight may be on the funders, right, from that position of power. And there's some really good books out there. I don't remember the book's title, but Mario Marino, who is both a philanthropist and has started nonprofits, has a really good book on this. And I think he's kind of writing to other funders like himself. There's another really good book called The Tyranny of Metrics, which I recommend to everyone. It's a like a 4 hour read, really creative. The author uses the HBO's The Wire
Oh,
to share
nice.
examples of how metrics can be disastrous and their lessons like don't do these things. And so where my book picks up where he kind of leaves off with just he's telling you very convincingly, don't do all these terrible metrics practices. So I kind of agree with him, but then I like to talk about, well, then what should metrics be doing for us?
Yeah.
And so that's where my book picks up where he leaves off.
No, honestly, this is a probably word you hear a lot, but I found the book pretty empowering. And I went to an event last night at Columbia University in Manhattan, and I met Peggy Shepard there from We Act, and paraphrasing something she said, "Come on, guys, we're in Manhattan. There's money everywhere. You just have to find it and then tell the people why it's important to spend on the project you want or show the benefit of it." I'm actually butchering what she said. It was a lot.
No, it
It was
made
definitely a
sense.
lot more eloquent than that. But
It made sense.
yeah, she made it sound really simple, and I know it isn't. But also, it was kind of inspiring too, frankly, because she's someone who's been doing this now basically as long as I've been alive, and she's still going out there every day trying to find different ways to get those projects to actually happen to help her community. And I think that's what all this is about. um and that's one of the aspects I loved about the book as well, because at the heart of it, it's let's find better, smarter ways to, and this part's going to sound a little cheesy, but I'm going to say it anyway, to make the world a better place.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, interesting. I know we're kind of starting to run up on time a little bit here, and I'm just kind of looking at my notes a bit. Um, what check. We're adding this part out, obviously. Oh, I got it. Earlier, you mentioned there are a number of stories you wanted to tell about about experience with nonprofits and your time working with them. Are there a couple you want to relay here?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I definitely have some favorite stories. There are a lot of stories in the book, but when I was writing it, I was determined not just to have success stories, but also stories of failure. I think that's was very important. And those failure stories were really hard to find. And I was like, why is that? Why is it so hard to find these stories? And I realized that failures in our sector often get swept under the rug because brand is everything, right? Because we're fundraising and our reputations matter so much. And so when a nonprofit fails, everyone gets embarrassed, including the board, including the donors. So no one really wants to talk about it, even though there's such important lessons, right, that we can all learn from. Um, so one of the stories I share in the book, there's a famous failure of an international development initiative. It was from 2005, and maybe you've heard of it. It's called One Laptop Per Child. And the idea was to build a low-cost, sturdy laptop for school children in developing countries around the world. And a lot of West Coast tech people were involved in this, and the concept seemed really revolutionary. So there were press conferences, lots of buzz. But as the effort moved forward, all these problems started to snowball. There were manufacturing issues, supply chain problems, software bugs, soaring costs, delivery issues, failure to adapt the features for local cultures. And children weren't even using the computers for their intended use. So, the project, like most nonprofits, was launched with the best of intentions and a sincere desire to make the world a better place. But unfortunately, there was more hype than impact. And so we have to make sure our own good intentions aren't derailed by sort of utopian thinking that isn't grounded in reality. And so then I like to compare them to another nonprofit. So one of my favorite examples of nonprofit experimentation is World Reader. So, World Reader is a nonprofit with a mission to bring digital books to disadvantaged children and their families. And so, when World Reader launched in 2010, they were really smart. They started several small experiments at the same time. So, in one small experiment, they gave Amazon Kindle e reader machines or tablets to elementary students in Ghana. And they were really excited. They thought this was the thing that was going to work. But what they learned was surprising. They found that when the children were playing during recess, the devices kept breaking. They didn't expect that. And at the same time, their team was experimenting with a mobile app, which they actually learned and were surprised by that from observation that the young users much preferred. Learning from those experiments, they leaned into the phone app, and today almost 200,000 young users a month are reading books on the mobile platform. And so, yeah, of course, there's some really good lessons when you unpack these stories. If World Reader would have gone all in on those Kindle e-reader machines that they were so excited about, they may not have ever discovered the better solution with the mobile app. So to me, a lesson is it's far better to fail fast and fail small before investing too big. And experimentation helps us learn and innovate through what I'll call intelligent failure. And so when you put those two stories side by side, the contrast is really striking. So the one laptop per child, they went really big, went really fast. And then when reality didn't match the vision, there was really no kind of pivot or, as you were talking about, like a learning process. There was no fallback. But World Reader, on the other hand, stayed really humble, stayed curious. They didn't assume they knew the answer or what would work. They went looking for it. And they let the children in Ghana tell them what worked just by watching, right? And learning. So I think the nonprofit sector is full of what I don't just think I know, right? That the nonprofit sector is full of enormous problems that deserve bold ambition. But bold ambition has to be paired with the discipline to test, observe, and adjust. And so it's so important for leaders and organizations to have that right attitude towards risk and failure. And another kind of related, very short story that I love from the Hewlett Foundation is that I laughed when I read about this, that they offer a prize to their grants officers that encourages them to share what they called the worst program from which you learned the most.
I
And
like that.
yeah, I think it's great, and they'd have these gatherings to discuss the worst grant they ever made and kind of laugh at themselves. And I love that they give themselves that freedom, right, to learn and to talk openly about their mistakes. And I think that's so important, and our sector struggles with that, sort of that risk aversion. But to me, that risk and intelligent failure is how breakthroughs happen and how innovation happens. So,
Absolutely agree with that. And actually hearing you speak there, especially at the end, Actually reminded me of a contract I had with the Department of Energy going back a couple years ago, going over social impacts of carbon capture projects, and it was painfully evident the applications who treated that section as a check the box exercise, and the ones who actually really understood it and cared about it, frankly. And those ones obviously always did better. And there's a lot of value in investing in this stuff and learning from the times that don't go well. So I think it's very smart of you to put examples in that didn't go, magically utopia, because that just isn't reality a lot of times. And a lot of times
Yeah.
you learn more from the screw up, from the mistakes, hopefully from those who came before you. Um, oh, one other thing I have to mention, the part about giving someone a laptop and expecting good things. Actually, my wife and I gave our children these little handheld recorder thingies, whether you could play Spotify on, and that's supposed to be it. Somehow my son was able to pull up YouTube on it and was just watching videos the entire time. So, like, not what I meant there, buddy.
Oh, it's funny. Yeah, good intentions, right? But
Good intentions.
unintended consequences from good intentions.
um, I have to ask, all your work with nonprofits, do you have a, I don't even know what the word is here, like a pet cause or a most important cause that you generally like to support? Is it climate change work? Is it hunger issues, poverty?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I've worked with all sorts of nonprofits. Probably one thing that I am really fired up about is just upward mobility,
Hmm.
is related to poverty. So, just workforce development initiatives that really empower people. I have a good friend that I met through the nonprofit Hive. Her name is Amina Mohammed, and she is the founder of Cameras for Girls.
Hmm.
And she's one of many examples in this kind of sector of helping people with upward mobility. But she was really passionate about, she's Canadian, but was born in Uganda. And so she has this nonprofit called Cameras for Girls, where she's teaching young women in Africa to go into the media for their careers. So teaching them, how to use cameras, how to story tell. It's really compelling, and she's doing great work. So I think she uses the word in power with the IN instead of EM, because she has this great way of saying it about how the power is already in you. It's she's not there to empower others, right? It's already in those girls, and she's just drawing it out, right? Drawing their skills and their talents out, through this. And so there's a lot of young women going through programs who are now, getting careers that they wouldn't have otherwise, right? And so I love that. It's so great. So it's not like a handout sort of story, right? It's and changing lives. So, but yeah, so many. I work with nonprofits all over the spectrum, whether it's education or poverty or healthcare. They're all, climate. They're all super important and they matter a lot. So, you asked for my favorite. That's what came to mind.
No, absolutely, that makes sense. And I think you kind of hit it on the head there that it's not always just the individual project. It's the fact that a lot of these groups act as force multipliers and
Yes, yes, that's a great word.
inspire like I'll call it class of people every couple of years to go on and become entrepreneurs, do their own thing, affect their own change throughout the world. And if they have that good base that they learned at the nonprofit, it will help them, I think, in their future work.
Yes, yeah, I like that force multiplier. That's very true.
Excellent. Well, I have to ask because the largest demographic of people who listen to this podcast, around 34% or so, I think it is young people
That's great.
under the age of 25. Is there anything you would say to them as to key takeaways here, or any advice
Yeah,
you have for them as they're looking to start their lives, pick a job, etc.?
yeah, that's wonderful. I love that. Yeah, I get so excited to see young people or early career people solving social problems. And I'm looking for stories like that. And when I find them, I get so excited. One of them is back in 2020 during the pandemic. Some college students were watching the news and just couldn't shake what they were seeing, that, farms with mountains of unsold food were dumping this food and people were going hungry at the same time. And so, they just couldn't get this out of their mind. And, supply chains were breaking down. So there's all this kind of just crisis happening. And so they were talking about it amongst themselves, and they got some friends together and decided, let's see if we can't do something about this. So they started making cold calls to farmers. They raised money for transportation, and they started moving the surplus food to food banks themselves. And they launched the nonprofit, which is called FarmLink. And since then, it's rescued millions of pounds of food for communities in need. And there's actually a documentary about them now. So I love that story. These young people prove that you don't need a title or 30 years of experience or track record or a fortune to make a real difference. And so when I'm out speaking with young people about nonprofit innovation, I also want to acknowledge that, none of this is easy. And especially if you're just getting started, the world can feel kind of discouraging when you're just starting out, and maybe you don't have a proven track record yet. You may not have authority yet or even access to funding, so you might feel discouraged. But challenging the status quo is hard for all of us, whether your early career or later career, it takes some courage. Um, if you're coming up with a new idea, you're always going to face skeptics and naysayers. If you're in an organization, you might run up against entrenched bureaucracy, people who say, oh, that's how we've always done things. There are egos, right? It's just reality, right? It's human nature. And so I mentioned that fog of good intentions, so people aren't going to agree on the best way to solve a social problem. So, just caring deeply about a problem doesn't always, help you solve it. So I just would say to young people, absolutely, the work, it can be messy and uncertain, but in good news, there's a lot that is under your control. As a young person, you get to discover your own superpower and what your unique talents and gifts are. I have a whole chapter on that called What's Your Superpower? And you get to choose the problems you want to work on that you care about. And, you can, no matter how hard your workplace might be or seem, you can ask yourself the hard questions like, am I actually in the right role? Or am I at the right organization? Maybe you are, maybe you aren't. Do I need to make a better pitch for my idea? Do I need to just be patient and wait for the right moment? Or, do I need to wait my terrible manager out until they leave and then, try again? So you can work on your idea on the weekends or as a volunteer, right? So there's a million options, right? And no matter what things seem like, you really are always in the driver's seat of your life. And so to me, what excites me and matters a lot is when a young person noticed a problem that they care about, and that's not nothing,
I agree with that.
that's everything. So I would just tell them, keep going, lean into that. We need you and we need your ideas.
I absolutely concur with that part. And I've really enjoyed our chat here today, but I wanted to also offer you the opportunity just overall to give any final thoughts you want, or if you potentially have any upcoming events or anything else you might want to plug.
Oh, that's great. Well, I have a website. It's just my name, so leahkral.com. And I care deeply about nonprofit innovation. I'm a cheerleader for that. I'm writing about it all the time. So I have if you go to my website, you can find my blog. I'm very active on LinkedIn. There's just a wonderful, active, engaged community of nonprofit folks discussing these things. And yeah, I'm out speaking a lot. And be sure to check out my book. It's available at all major book retailers. And yeah, feel free to reach out. And if you care about these things, let's get to know each other and start a conversation.
That's a great way to end it, I think. Again, also thank you very much, Leah. I have enjoyed this, and thank you everybody listening.
Thanks again. This was fun.